So many people have drawn my attention to this ABC article that has been released, how Australian coral became big business. Now this article is unfortunately written with a lot of biases, and I'll go through and unpack some of this for you. So if you wanted to make the industry look bad, then this has done a pretty good job, and it has cherry-picked some very minor examples to totally misrepresent what is otherwise a very well-kept reef. What Australia has done and the way Australia is going about our conservation is a credit to the world. Now, various countries have pillaged their reef, and various countries have done a terrible job with coral conservation. But on the other hand, Australia has done a very good job. Now, I've been involved in the Australian coral trade since 1994, and I have made in excess of 20 visits to the Great Barrier Reef, and I've gone out many times with divers, and I have absolute first-hand experience understanding the full chain of custody for the Australian coral industry. I've also done numerous trips to many places overseas, and I am very accurately able to compare the exemplary standards that we have in Australia and compare them to some of the absolutely terrible standards that some of the world engages in. Now, Australia gets tarred with the same brush as other countries that are not doing the right thing. For example, when Senator Hill was in, he was watching a 60 Minutes program about some of the atrocities that occur on coral reefs. He then used his position to close the Great Barrier Reef. And then after a lot of action from the industry itself, it ended up becoming completely apparent that the way Australia deal with our coral reef is actually world standard, and that the program that he was watching that made him decide to take that drastic action was actually shot at and filmed and all about what goes on in the Philippines, which has absolutely nothing to do with Australia. So this topic is a very emotive topic. Lots of emotions run high, but we need to look at fact. We cannot go on ideology, because there are many sides to everything. And if you want to take the view that you take a coral from the ocean and the coral dies and therefore it has degraded the reef and served for no other value, then you can take that view. On the other hand, removing a coral from an environment is no different from removing a tree from a forest. If you remove one tree here and one tree there, all that does is create more space for other things to occupy. But if you go and clear it, then suddenly that is a problem. But in Australia, coral clearing really isn't a thing. Cherry picking amongst the corals is basically how it goes on. And if you remove one here and then one over there, all it does is create space for others to actually grow. Now, the media loves headlines and the media loves scare campaigns. Just like the bleaching events, the coral reef has various very real stresses that we need to be aware of, and things that we do have to manage, and that Australia all in all does a very good job of. But we cannot underestimate the coral reef's ability to survive. For example, an Australian bush is designed to weather bushfires. Now, not only does the Australian bush weather bushfires, the Australian bush actually thrives due to bushfires. So when there's a fire in the Australian bush, if you go back to that same bush 5 years later, you will find more diversity and you'll find less invasive species. Any area not hit by a bushfire tends to have less diversity and tends to have a lot more problem with invasive species. And just like the Australian bush has evolved to handle various stresses, so has the Great Barrier Reef. So if you go to an area which has been bleached, then you will see visible stress. You will see problems as a result of the bleaching. But if you go back 6 months to even 12 months later, you'll find that reef is potentially healthier than others. And cyclones and crown of thorn starfish and all these other things that have been touted as destroying the reef, they never do. Because the reef only ever has done one thing. It's evolved, it's moved, it's changed, it's grown, it's contracted, it's done all sorts of things. But the one thing it does do is survive. And there are various reefs that you could have gone to after a bleaching event and you could think this was terrible, and it was. But then you can go back to that same reef 6 to 12 months later and it can be in unbelievable condition because of its natural ability to weather these sorts of events and to evolve and thrive. Okay, so the first thing it says here is Australia's Great Barrier Reef is being literally chipped away at to build private aquariums. Now conservationists are raising the alarm. Well, you will never have a problem finding a conservationist that wants to get upset about something. This is absolutely a given. And once again, if the collectors were going down there and chipping coral after coral after coral after coral, then this statement may ring true. But the reality is that the way they collect in Australia is actually highly regulated, and it is actually completely sustainable. Now, I'm not saying that everyone does the right thing, and sometimes people get caught doing the wrong thing, and these people need to be dealt with by law, and these people do not represent the industry, because I am personal friends with a lot of these people, and I can tell you now that they have long-term visions for their industry, and they play by the rules. And the thing is, if you're going to do the wrong thing in Australia, you're actually going to get caught, because the checks and balances that they put in are significant. So I am not condoning anyone that's doing the wrong thing. I'm also not naive enough to say that nobody's doing the wrong thing, because that's just not a reality. There is the odd person doing the wrong thing. And this video is not here to defend those people. This video is here to defend the industry. Because here in Australia, we should be very proud of the way we're managing our Great Barrier Reef. Now, there are things that are happening to the reef which are outside of our control. But let me assure you, the Great Barrier Reef is not dying. The Great Barrier Reef is thriving. Actually, last year, it had the largest coral cover and best distribution ever. Now, do you read about that in the media? No, because the media pushing these globalist agendas only like to promote the terrible stories, because obviously they sell papers better. So, for example, I used to go out with collectors, and I'd go to a single atoll, and the collector that I was with said, look, I have collected here for 17 years, and you find me one place that I've removed a coral. And you literally couldn't even find anywhere, because corals grow so much faster than you think they do. And if there's a little bit of space here or a little bit of space there, because one coral's removed here and one coral's removed there, then all that does is just allow the corals around it to grow. Because the corals all have Encodi poisonous cells and so forth, and when the corals are close to each other, they sting each other for competition, and when there's a little bit of space, that allows them to grow much faster and occupy that space. So to think that we're chipping away the reef, well, technically that's true. But the way they're doing it, taking one from over here and one from over there, is completely sustainable. Even to the point that I can go to a single atoll and not see anywhere that a coral has been removed, despite the fact that it has been cautiously collected from by one person for 17 years. The way that they do these headlines are very, very deceptive, but unfortunately accurate in a worst case scenario, but not representative of the industry. Now, here is some very factual information put in a way to make something very good sound very bad. So it says, despite the perilous state of the Great Barrier Reef, the government allows private companies to harvest coral from it. There are limits and penalties for fishermen who take too much are severe. Yes, the government does allow private companies to harvest the coral, and yes, there's limits, and yes, there is severe penalties. So I don't know why you're framing that as a bad thing. That's a good thing. And then it goes on to say, but the reefs are literally chipped away to build private aquariums around the world. Okay. Concerns are growing for the practice could be adding one stress too many to the ecosystem. Well, once again, because they are removed sustainably, and because Australia looks after our Great Barrier Reef very well, I think this was a badly written little paragraph to make something that we should be proud of look bad. Researchers have even said coral harvesting, which targets the most colourful varieties, might even drain some coral colonies of colour. Now, I'm pretty sure there's no evidence at all of that, because often the colour of the coral is very much related to a lot of the conditions that are present. For example, we can get a coral into our aquarium which is very colourful, and it can totally lose its colour because of the conditions present. We also can get corals that have got no colour, and we can put them in our coral aquarium and we can make them very colourful just by providing the right conditions, minor and trace elements and so forth. So if we're able to manipulate our colour in the environment, then the corals in the environment would also be able to be manipulated. That isn't really true, because the colour of a coral is various pigments and reactions to zooxanthellae, and it is the case that a coral can easily change colour. So if you say, oh, they're removing the bright red corals, there's not going to be any more bright red corals. That isn't true, because often, if the conditions are right for your red coral to become a bright red coral, then it becomes a bright red coral. If the conditions, let's say your phosphates and nitrates are up too high or whatever, you'll lose a lot of your colours and they go brown. So it's not like they have a skin colour. It is that the corals are reacting to various conditions and the colour of the coral is able to change. Now it says, it doesn't help that one of Australia's biggest coral harvesters is currently facing criminal prosecution for illegal harvesting coral from protected areas in the Great Barrier Reef. And once again, I am not condoning anyone doing the wrong thing. And our government is very good at finding people doing the wrong thing. And you cannot tarnish the wonderful reputation of our industry by bad players. You've got to find the bad players. You don't destroy the industry. Australia's coral harvest industry has even attracted bans from the European Union and the United Kingdom over concerns about sustainability. Now that statement just then pretty much made it look like they're banning corals. But it appears that there are 5 species of coral that they are concerned about, and that may have very good reason for that. So if there are a few species that maybe don't fare well in the transport, or maybe there are valid reasons for those 5 corals not to be imported into the EU or the UK. So that statement pretty much tarred the brush of that statement made the whole industry look bad for 5 individual species, when potentially not bringing those 5 species to the UK or EU may have actually been a very good idea, and absolutely no representation on the rest of the reef. Now, I know that some corals don't transport well, and for example, the grubrescens is one of them. So if it doesn't transport well, and they've got concerns for this particular coral, then maybe they shouldn't import that coral into the EU and the UK. But I know they get other corals very well and very successfully. And once again, the craze within the coral keeping is all about fragging and all about sustainability anyway. So in some cases, individual species have found their way to Great Britain or the UK, and a lot of the hobbyists have done such a good job in propagating them that not only have they propagated them and sold them fluently within the UK and the EU, they're actually even creating their own colours and their own types of various Australian corals. So there's a lot of very good work done within the aquarium industry. And once again, it is possible that there can be issues with the Great Barrier Reef, and we could lose species, and then there could be thousands, tens of thousands, or whatever of that same species safe in people's aquariums, which later could be introduced. And there are examples of that, where various types of fish, coral, and so forth have been wiped out in the wild, but due to abundance in our aquariums, they are not lost. So you can make all this stuff sound doomy and gloomy, but there's also another side, because you're dealing with people that love their animals, people that look after their animals. Now, that's not to say there's bad nuts, because there is, but there's also a lot of wonderfulness that comes out of the aquarium industry. And having these aquariums is what gives people the passion and the desire to look after them in the wild. Now it says, but none of this has slowed the world's appetite for Australian coral. Of course it's not going to, because Australia is one of the most sustainable and high quality fisheries you can buy from. So of course people want to buy Australian, because Australians look after it. Now it says stewards versus scientists. Some government organisations, such as the Australian Marine Conservative Society, want to end coral harvesting on the reef altogether. Now I'm sure that you could speak to someone within that organisation and get that opinion, but I'm sure that you would find many people in that organisation that do not share that opinion. This isn't a fishery that solves problems with food security or something. No, it's not. But it certainly does increase awareness and people's passion and drive to solve the real conservation issues. This is a global aquarium trade. Yep. Campaign manager Simon Miller says. Then they've just got a guy here looking very unhappy with a bunch of bleached coral. Now, no one's happy about bleached coral. And in the aquarium industry, we do everything we can to sell live, healthy, thriving corals. And unfortunately, occasionally they die. But as far as the white bleached coral trade is concerned, Australia hasn't engaged in that for quite some time. And bleached dead coral is something very frowned upon in the industry. And no one collects corals for the purpose of bleaching anymore, because it wouldn't be worth it, because the Australian government makes it too expensive and too unsustainable to go selling part of your license quota on dead stuff. So that's not even a factor anymore. So coral scientist Dr. Morgan Pritchett says the industry has flown under the radar because of its negligible size. Well, yes, compared to other industries, the aquarium industry is absolutely minute. Now, one single cyclone would wipe out way more coral than the industry would in a year. One single putting down of your anchor would destroy more coral than a acarist would. Increasing threats to the reef, he says widespread support for the industry that the industry has enjoyed is unlikely to continue. Absolutely false. Now, if lots of disinformation like this keeps getting put out, then you can upset lots of people and fill them with disinformation, and you can make that true. But the reality is that the Australian coral reef is looked after very well, and it is completely sustainable. So therefore, this statement is just scaremongering. So it says, we're now saying, well, hang on, given the state of the reef, maybe we should rethink the industry, he says. Yes, and the industry is constantly looking at itself. It is constantly looking at how to do things better and more effectively. And because ultimately, if we sell coral that stays alive, we sell coral. If we sell coral that dies, then people stop buying it pretty damn quick. And we need to keep doing a better job. That's what we need to do. We need to keep improving it, because it does bring money into the industry, into the country, and it does increase the awareness. So people with a coral reef are more likely to be involved in looking after the reef than someone that doesn't. So now it says, unlike the Australian Marine Conservation Society, he's not calling for a total ban. He does, however, want the industry to provide some data to prove it's sustainable. Good. I think the more we get data, the more we work with the industry, and the more we prove it's sustainability, and the more we rat out the people doing the wrong job, then